I hope everyone's staying safe and sane out there, or as sane as possible. It's certainly a interesting time at the Terner Center. We've had, as you know, before this pandemic started, we had a whole suite of policy work and research that we've been advancing, and we very quickly have had to kind of shuffle and reprioritize a lot of that work in light of everything that's happened. So, we had a very significant housing crisis before this, and it is very possible that everything that's happening right now is going to exacerbate that problem. And so, while we're not completely starting new, we have to kind of think about a lot of the work we were doing in the context of what is housing going to look like during COVID, once shelter in place has been lifted, and in the months and years that follow. So today I'm going to talk through what we have been tracking on the local, state, and federal level as far as responses to the pandemic, specific to housing, and then some thoughts on some perhaps opportunities to implement some of the structural changes that we have been making recommendations on for some time in light of the increased need for more housing coming out of this crisis. So I'll try not to talk too much. I think what would help me is hearing from everyone on the call here. You all have some really great and important experiences on the ground dealing with the ramifications of this crisis. And I think one of the strengths of the Terner Center is our ability to draw on practitioners like many of you to inform where we should be focusing our research and our efforts. So I want to leave plenty of time for that conversation as well. But I'll go ahead and just jump into the presentation now. As we all know, this crisis is very different from the last one we suffered through, in that it is not specifically a housing crisis, but it is so wide in breadth that there's going to be a tremendous impact on housing. We know that, and we're seeing some of that now. So this is a chart I think a lot of us are probably already familiar with. This is from the New York Times. It is the initial jobless claims per week. And as just skyrocketed to just
A little muty on my end. Am I the only one?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, right there is good.
I've not the best internet connection. I'm using a makeshift storage shack in the backyard of our complex to escape from my 3-year-old. So I apologize in advance for any technical difficulties. So I may cut out here and there. But as I was saying, it's really clear we have a staggering number of folks who are losing their jobs or losing their income, and as a result, we are going to see an increasing difficulty in these individuals to pay rent, to mortgage payments. And so this is data from the National Multi-Housing Coalition. We're seeing I wouldn't say a crash, but we are seeing a significant decline in the ability of renters to make their rent. This has actually been outdated. They actually came out with new data today that shows that number is actually closer to 80%, which is closer to April 2019.
Hey, David, you keep cutting out on my end, and I think you're cutting out on a lot of other people's ends too. Is it possible? I'm just wondering, right, there's a way that you can call in on a phone and talk while you're doing the presentation. Would that be maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that if you'll bear with me for 1 second.
Yeah. Because this seems super interesting. I'd love to actually be able to fully hear what you say.
Oh, and I want you to hear what I have to say, so.
Cool.
And David, I'm looking on the back end, copy invitation. Telephone works.
Yeah, I'm looking at the invitation. I don't see a number for calling in.
And I think, let me try something.
Okay, I have it here in the email invite. So let me do that.
Cool.
So I'm going to mute myself here.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, and I see it as well.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
All right. Apologize for that. Thank you for all sticking with me. So the big point I'm trying to make in this slide is that people are going to have a hard time paying rent, which has ramifications for trying to just keep our housing infrastructure in place, right? So on top of that, we're also seeing some pretty significant impacts to projects that are happening right now. So for example, this is a clip from New York City, which has paused all residential building. We obviously know that that is somewhat the case here in the Bay Area as well, particularly if you do not have an affordable component on site. And a number of other cities have followed suit. Seattle, Boston, Pennsylvania, those cities have all halted residential construction for the time being. A number of other cities have followed the Bay Area's lead, where you need an affordable component to continue construction. So that's going to exacerbate our supply issue in many of these high cost areas. And for projects that are continuing to move forward, they face their own challenges as well. For example, they are experiencing delays on the city side. So delays in inspections for projects moving through approval processes, delays in commission hearings and whatnot. And so that's a challenge. We've seen in some instances increasing costs because of supply chain disruptions. We know that the amount of goods coming into our ports has declined, and that trickles down to the job sites, to our ability to actually get materials to build houses. And we know that construction costs were already a huge issue before, and maybe in the long term, this will level off, but right now we're seeing some spikes in costs. And then lastly, we have an impact on the workforce in places where workers are still coming to the job site. Many of them have to make a choice whether to stay home with their kids or to continue working. And on top of that, builders have to now adhere to pretty strict social distancing standards. So this, again, exacerbates an issue that we already had before, which was a lack of a full workforce. So all of those things combined are going to make it very challenging to meet our housing goals that we had before the crisis, and it's going to create a new crisis. And so in response, the federal government has acted. I think you're probably all familiar with the CARES Act, the $2 trillion relief bill. Was not specific to housing, but included many components that were specific to housing. So I'm going to run through them pretty quickly here. I'll note that many of the housing changes were partly, or I should say wholly, because of the coordinated advocacy efforts of many housing groups nationally, and even here in the state of California. So they did a very important job of pushing for housing assistance in this bill. And so included in the bill are some specific appropriations for housing providers through the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, through Community Development Block Grants. And then there's also guidance on moratoriums on foreclosures and evictions. 60%, or I should say, 60-day foreclosure moratorium on federally backed mortgages, and options for forbearance. We see similar guidance for eviction moratoriums for homes covered by federally backed mortgages and backed through other means such as LIHTC projects or public housing authorities. And then we see similar protections for renters in federally backed multifamily buildings. So, and then in addition to these very housing specific components, there are parts of the CARES Act that will have an indirect impact on housing. For example, $150 billion was set aside for flexible city funding. Now, a lot of cities are using this to shore up their budgets, to provide resources for their essential workers, but some cities are using this money to provide direct rental assistance as well, but they're not obligated to do so. And we'll talk about some examples of this in a few slides. Of course, I think this is probably the most publicized piece of the bill was the $1,200 stimulus checks, which are one-time checks and are certainly not enough to pay rent, and certainly not in California and not moving forward. But I think it's important to note that I don't think these checks were designed to be rental assistance. They were direct payments for stimulus purposes. And so I think probably the more generous benefit coming out of the CARES Act is the $600 a week boost to unemployment. And so combined with stimulus checks and other aid, some, certainly not all, but some individuals and families impacted by the economic fallout from the pandemic are receiving assistance and will be able to use that funding to help pay bills such as the rent. That being said, there's widespread consensus that the CARES Act is not enough and much more needs to be done specific to housing. So the phase 4, which is being formulated as we speak, is going to perhaps have some direct rental assistance included in it. If anyone was following the first CARES Act, you'll know that Speaker Pelosi had her own bill that included $100 billion for rental assistance. Obviously, that was not included in the final bill, which was the Senate version, but it showed that there was an appetite to move that forward. So, and pretty much every housing group is advocating for this as well in this phase 4 bill. But one of the big points of contention is how much is needed and what's the right mechanism to deliver that funding, right? So by some estimates, we need about $100 billion to cover the most vulnerable populations for a year, for 12 months. And where I think a lot of groups are in disagreement is how we should be delivering that money. Should we be funneling the money through housing choice vouchers? Should we be using home funding? Should we use emergency solutions grants? Should we use FEMA? Each of those options has pros and cons, but it's not really clear to anyone right now what would be the best way to get money in people's hands now, or go directly to landlords to help basically cover the rent while rent freezes are in place, while moratoriums are in place, so that there's not a shock once shelter in place is rescinded. So that's something to keep an eye on, is the form that this direct rental assistance takes in this phase 4 housing bill. A couple other things to keep an eye on are extension of different LIHTC deadlines, occupancy deadlines, things like that. And then more direct payments overall. Again, we only had $1,200 max per individual. I think there's consensus that to the effect that there's supposed to be stimulus payments, that's not enough. And so we may see more of those in a future bill as well. Now moving to California. California has been really trying to address this crisis head on, particularly when we talk about vulnerable populations. And so Governor Newsom and the legislature have put forward new funding to support $100 million directly to local governments to expand shelter services, to lease hotel rooms and whatnot, and then an additional $50 million for the state, specifically to purchase trailers and also to rent hotel rooms. And You can see a headline here. This is from Cal Matters, I think from last week. And while they are moving pretty quickly to house individuals, it's only a fraction of the number of people who are actually on our streets. So I think it's not clear whether we will actually make a huge dent in the number of folks that are homeless right now, but the administration is certainly trying to do this, both through their executive orders and through some of this funding. The other major response from the administration has been their limitations on evictions. The governor issued an executive order in early March, which many advocates felt did not go far enough. It basically gave cities the authority to implement eviction protections. And so in late March, he expanded that order to basically ban evictions in the event that a tenant notifies a landlord in writing they cannot pay rent because of income loss because of COVID. So that was further than the previous executive order, but still a lot of folks were not satisfied with that. Most housing groups were not happy with that. Many legislators, particularly in San Francisco, were not happy with that either. So this is supposed to be in place through the end of May. I can't imagine that it won't be extended, but as of now, the executive order is through the end of May. So the local responses to COVID are to me the most interesting because they are the groups that are really seeing what's happening on the ground. And so I'm going to walk through some of those responses that we've been tracking. Certainly the most, or the first tool out of the toolbox has been things like eviction moratoriums. Even before the governor announced his executive order, cities were already putting moratoriums in place. Some have gone further, putting in place rent freezes, particularly for rent-controlled properties. And so that seems to be the first tool that most cities are using. They're also moving quickly on reducing homelessness, which I think has been helped by funding from the federal government, from the states. And so we see a lot of that happening now. But a lot of cities are using some of these dollars to provide more direct assistance. So for example, this is a headline from LA County's decision to move ahead with the rental assistance program, using federal and philanthropic dollars to provide money directly to tenants so that they can continue making their rent payments. Several cities are pursuing this. The city of Boston is doing this, New Orleans, Chicago. They all have similar programs in place to provide this kind of funding directly to tenants. And then lastly, a lot of planning departments have had to get really creative in their approaches to keeping the housing pipeline moving. So this includes strategies like doing virtual site inspections, moving commission hearings online through Zoom, and really trying to stretch as much capacity out of their already capacity constrained departments because they know that they want to keep the pipeline of new homes moving forward. So what will be interesting, and something we'll touch on in a bit, is how many of these new practices are worth continuing on after the pandemic subsides, because a lot of these planning departments and cities in general, they're going to take big budget hits because of declining revenue, and it's almost certainly going to result in a reduction in planning staff. So it'll be interesting to see how innovations they're taking now could be more long-term interventions to shore up capacity. So that was a very quick, broad overview of what's happening at different levels of government to respond. But a lot of that has been kind of emergency responses. And we're trying to think about, long-term recovery and strategies to use this crisis to catalyze structural change that we have been making recommendations on for some time, right? And I think we're in a really good position to do this. Our executive director, Carol Galante, and our new managing director, Ben Metcalf, they were both at HUD during the last crisis. And so they have a lot of great experience and ideas about how we can do better than we did last time, right? So some of these ideas include continuing to build housing during the downturn, right? Counter-cyclical spending on housing. Do we have opportunities to restructure the money at the state level that we have passed through bonds, through different programs, to front load to build in the next year, maybe 2 years, when the market is not producing as much housing? Can we restructure those programs? That's something I think we should be considering. Also, to the extent that we may see more distressed properties or just a general decline in real estate prices, are local governments, nonprofits in a position to land bank, to acquire assets? Are we going to allocate money for this? We tried to do this in the last recession to some success through programs like the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. What can we learn from those programs, and then craft a better program moving forward? Because I do think last time a lot of governments were caught a bit flat-footed. This time we understand we already had a housing crisis, right? So it's not a tough sell to say, if prices are going to decline, if more assets are going to become available, we need to be in a position to take advantage of that and create more affordable housing, particularly as cities start having to meet these more strict arena requirements for their lower income housing goals. And then just broadly, elevating pro-housing ideas. This really speaks to the number of ideas we had moving through the legislature in Sacramento that weren't specific to the pandemic, but are going to be even more important as we think about maintaining supply as we go through recession and recovery. So things like local zoning, housing element law, density bonus, impact fees, things like that are just as important, but I think are going to need to be reframed in the lens of how do we recover after the pandemic, so that we don't dig ourselves into a deeper hole with our supply, particularly here in California. And then I think one of the big challenges we're going to face is that what happens to those vulnerable populations that we're putting in hotels right now, that we're putting in convention centers. Once shelter in place is alleviated, I think it's pretty unfathomable to think that we're simply going to return them to their previous circumstances. So are we adequately planning for transition to supportive housing for those individuals, or are we really going to let them fall back into previous situations? I think we need to do some thinking on that. And then lastly, this is something I touched on earlier, is how are cities going to try and innovate in the face of constrained budgets and decreased capacity? So these are things like using mobile technologies, perhaps looking at some of their zoning and planning rules and regulations to alleviate burden on their planning staff. So trying to keep track of some best practices. What are cities doing now that works, that can be scaled to other places? So trying to keep an eye on that. So that is, from a 5,000-foot view, what we're initially trying to keep track of. I will say we plan on publishing a number of briefs and blog posts in the coming weeks and months that touch on a lot of these topics. So, and then providing research as well. As we get more data and we understand what the impacts are, we want to put out timely research that can inform all of these conversations moving forward. So I'm going to leave it there. Appreciate everyone hanging tight while I figured out the technical difficulties, but I really do want to hear from everyone, thoughts on anything I went over, experiences you are having, as practitioners, and anything else I missed. So thanks, Corey. Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it. And I'll stop there.
Todd, you got your hand up and unmuted.
Thank you. So, so David, thank you. That was great. Something you said towards the end, like totally strikes a chord with me, and I'm curious from a policy point of view, what do you think needs to happen? So I feel like the opportunity we have, homelessness being sheltered, right? Like we're getting, we've moved a significant part of the homeless, of people experiencing homeless population off the streets into shelter. What do we need to see happen to keep them in shelter? as opposed to, as you were saying, like it's kind of unfathomable. We'll move them back onto the street, but how do we make sure that that unfathomable thing does not happen? What do we need to do that?
That's a great question. And I don't have a great answer to that yet. I think part of the solution has to go to the whole counter-cyclical spending thing. So to the extent we have assets that are going to become available, can we make plays for those and use them as supportive housing pieces, right? So that we are not just moving people from shelter to shelter. I think we need real solutions. And honestly, some of the things we are doing are things that we perhaps should have been doing before the pandemic. And it took a crisis of this proportion to actually start getting people off the street. So I don't have a real solution for you yet. I would toss that back out to the group for ideas, but that is a really, really key point that I think needs to be front and center of these longer term recovery conversations.
I mean, what I would say, David, is that Corey and I mean, a couple of weeks ago now at this point, we had a conference call with Senator Feinstein's office, and this was the main topic that they were interested in solving for that. And so, I mean, I just feel like, you know, under the headline of never waste a good crisis, right? Like what politically accomplishable now that wasn't a month or 6 weeks ago, right? Like that seems like the top, to me, if it's not the top, one of the top things that people are interested in solving for that problem.
Yeah, and just one thought on that is, you know, this was a topic of interest before the crisis, and I think it's going to be even more important is expediting the construction of supportive housing, right? And there's a couple bills to help do that, in addition to what we saw from the last session. So I think to the extent we can start standing up some of this stuff and removing the barriers to doing that so that we have some at least temporary solution once shelter in place is over, I think we should be prioritizing that as well.
So looking into the chat, if you're able to see and read directly, David, kind of first question talking about Section 8 housing. Any idea when it'll open up? Section 811 to 12, and are we going to see reframing from NIMBYs on the topics?
So that's a really great question. There has been a lot of discussion going back to this, at the federal level, direct rental assistance, what the right mechanism is. And some are advocating for expanding either project-based vouchers or housing choice vouchers just for tenants. I think that makes, this is just me speaking personally, I think that makes a lot of sense because the PHAs are really, that's what they do. They are set up to income verify and to provide payments directly to landlords. That being said, I think politically, I've heard that's going to be a difficult lift. So I don't know if Section 8 housing choice vouchers will be the vehicle moving forward, although a lot of groups are pushing for that. So I think, go ahead.
Continue, go on.
So I think this could be an opportunity to expand housing choice vouchers. I think they're proven and they work. But I think politically we're not seeing everyone coalesce around that. But it's still pretty early in those conversations, and so that may change. And it may be a combination of programs at the federal level, right? It could be housing choice vouchers for some. It could be another program providing direct assistance to landlords who can prove a loss of income in exchange for, you know, waiving rents for the tenants, right? So I think it doesn't have to be just one program. It could be actually a couple of them.
Yeah, and to that exact point, the next comment down in the chat was from Karen, who runs Home Match SF. You know, we have housing that is open, and not every bedroom in the state of California has somebody sleeping in it, right? So it's how can we utilize, to your point, multiple solutions at once, and with Karen's efforts as well to have a multi-pronged approach. I totally agree. Leslie's kind of next couple comments, and I think I'd be really interested to hear from kind of everybody on this. How are people going to view density when this is over, right? Because I talk to folks, they go, oh, you see what happens in New York City? It's the densest city in the country. It's creating all these problems. And in San Francisco, the second densest city in the country, I would say we're, one of the better models, certainly not perfect in every single way. But like, so maybe even for the group, how are people going to view that going forward? And how do we, play hopefully a positive role in that? And maybe David start out, and I don't know if anyone else wants to.
That's one of my biggest concerns, is that the density the COVID pandemic is going to be used as cover for someone's already existing anti-density views. I haven't seen official analysis on this yet, but everything I've seen, there's not a direct correlation, or at least a strong correlation, between density and the spread of the virus, right? Like you brought it up, San Francisco has handled it fairly well, and it is a pretty dense place. A lot of the densities in Japan have done pretty well. So I don't think it's a clear connection between density and the spread of the virus. I understand that might fit some people's feelings of density, but I think at the same time, in low density places, it's not as if you are not bumping into people. You go to the grocery store, you go to the gym, there are shared spaces wherever you go. So I think it's important, as we get clarity on data around COVID, can we show that there is a link between density and the spread of the virus? So perhaps that's out there. I have not seen it, but I don't think a lot of people are making that argument in good faith, at least from what I've seen.
David, is that something that the Terner Center would want to look at? Because I definitely think that it's going to be an issue, and I've heard and read a number of articles about this, and some people are saying it's not density, it's overcrowding, which are two different things. If you have dense housing versus you have too many people packed in a unit, but then how do we message that with some facts? So it would be great if you guys would think about that.
I think that's an excellent point. I would love to dig into that, and so I can toss that around to the team and see what we can do. I think we need a bit more clarity on everything that happens from COVID. I think we're still probably pretty early to draw any conclusions, but I think once we get to that point, that would be an excellent and important analysis to do.
In a point in the chat, there are plenty of places that are not considered, dense urban environments where we are seeing lots of cases. It's kind of causation correlation. Okay, so going up, Sean mentions, and we've seen this in San Francisco as well. What do you think about the San Jose model? And is that one where we could replicate statewide? They have money for temporary shelters, FEMA reimbursed. I know Supervisor Haney is talking about that in San Francisco with this sheltering everybody in homeless facilities. He's basically said the federal government's going to give us all the money back to do this. Is that real? And maybe you can just kind of opine on what that looks like.
So I think there are certainly resources coming from the federal government, and a lot of them are starting to trickle down now. What I haven't seen is an analysis of whether or not it's enough. And so I certainly think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to leverage that money to do things like what San Jose is doing. I don't know the specifics on the San Jose model, but I know that a lot of cities are replicating that in some form, using dollars coming from the state, dollars coming from the federal government to move very quickly on temporary shelters. So yeah, I absolutely think we should be doing that.
I'm just coming in. Yeah, Michael shared an article from She Shall Not Be Named in Cal Matters. attempts to stop housing. Could say that our executive director sent his thoughts on that to the Cal Matters editorial team. About why.
It's funny. I have a guess of who that is, but I would know that based on your introduction.
And that
Yeah, well,
honestly,
like I said, I think there's going to be a lot of bad faith arguments linking density and specifically just building more housing to COVID, and I think that's unfortunate. But to Leslie's point, we do need to have some data to engage in those discussions to the extent that we have to engage in them. I think a lot of people understand that these are not good faith arguments, but not everyone will. I think it's pretty easy to look at New York and see the difficulties that they're having with this, and to link that directly to being near more people, right? I don't think that's unreasonable thought to have, but we do need to be able to have some data and anecdotes to have that conversation when we need to have it.
But I mean, isn't like the immediate counter argument is Seoul, South Korea, being like, like they right? It wasn't about density; it was about the health response, right? Like the emergency measures, how seriously they took in place, right? It didn't help that de Blasio, right, 2 weeks into it was like everyone should go to the gym and go to bars, right? Like, it wasn't density. That was him just being a fool, right? And so again, I think like what you said earlier, right? People who already are anti-housing or anti-density will just add this to the list. But I'm not sure that it moves. I don't know. It seems like there's as many counter examples.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of those anecdotes, but I think from my perspective, to the extent we can actually have some data behind this, will help. Some people will choose not to believe that, but at the same time, I think we need something to point to other than just looking at other cities. I think there's validity in that, but I also, as speaking for a university community, I want to be able to point to some data that says, look, there's actually not a correlation here.
Right. I mean, and Barry Schatz and Michael Lane are kind of like in the comments, like pointing out that, right, like Santa Clara County is the epicenter of density to San Francisco, right? In New York, well, it was New Rochelle, right, was kind of the hot spot, and that was not like so. Yeah. Sorry, I'll cut it off my head.
Lots of other narratives that we have to tackle that aren't true as well. So,
which is nothing new anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
we've spent a lot of time just trying to work on getting the facts out there, and it's always a balance between how much do you acknowledge people who are just spewing nonsense versus, well, if they're actually influencing people, then to a certain extent you want to make sure you're getting the good data out there. And I know our organization certainly relies and appreciates on everything the Terner Center put out. The analysis on impact fees and the overall production on housing is just like, that is such a bite-sizable, everybody understands this. It's a source people can trust. And understandably, there's a lot going on right now. And I think once we perhaps get through the worst of the mental health emergency that we're in the middle of right now, then okay, let's actually look at some of these policies and analyze how we can be better going forward.
So if I can take the liberty, I want to know from the group, from some of the folks on the ground, what impacts you're feeling from all of this, and what your thoughts are on the ability to build housing moving forward. I have heard anecdotally from some builders that they don't anticipate being able to get financing for projects that they have entitled now, or are close to having entitled, and that costs are going up, which is something I mentioned earlier. Anything like that is more information for us to be focusing our efforts. So I'm curious if anyone has any insights there. Don't have to share them now. Hopefully everyone has my email and can reach out to me directly, but I'm always very interested in hearing those experiences from people who are actively trying to build housing and help with the housing crisis.
I mean, I can start on one. So I don't know, David, if you were on when Todd mentioned this. We have a conversation scheduled for Friday with some general contractors about safety on the job site and what GCs are doing to ensure that things are happening safely. That was definitely one area that we've seen a little bit of the general public And the GCs are saying that they are getting, feedback about, little things here and there, certainly at the beginning of, hey, these are not happening the right way. They're not keeping distance. Maybe they are on the job site, but then everybody's walking to their cars afterwards and, right next to each other and not practicing social distancing that we need to. So I do think that it's on us as an industry to convey specifically about job site safety. That is one area that we've identified as a problem area, because people just don't understand. Oh, okay, you're actually getting your temperature checked when you walk in every single day. You are maintaining social distancing on the job site. I forget which one of them, they had some sort of, and maybe more details on Friday, some sort of thermal camera imaging to actually make sure that people are staying 6 feet apart from one another on the job site to make sure they stay safe. So that was, I thought, all interesting. Barry, I see you there. You should be unmuted.
We just finished, I just did my first in Sacramento County with the architect and the contractor. We're about 2 weeks away from at least a TCO, so that it hasn't gotten in the way because we're in Rancho Cordova and every inspection, every department is open and they're digitally signing things, they're virtually reviewing things where possible, they're doing drive-bys, and we're having no problem getting that one finished miraculously. We're getting ready to start another one in the North Bay, but both of these projects, I'd point out, are funded by the Veterans Homeless and Housing and Homeless Prevention called for market rate projects to get the labor they need, the financing they need, and the materials they need. And so this may be a situation where affordable housing is the only game in town, the only thing you can get built.
Yeah, I think that may be true, at least to a small extent. Barry, I'm interested in your experience with these, with Rancho, was it Rancho Cordova?
Rancho Cordova.
Yeah, what your experience has been with these new tactics that the city is taking to kind of move projects forward. Are they clunky? Do you find them actually more efficient? I would be curious what your thoughts are on that.
Sorry, David, you cut out there for a second. You were asking about what again?
Oh, just your experience with Rancho Cordova's change in keeping their planners and inspectors moving. Has it been better or worse than business as usual?
It has been better, if anything. Yeah, they have been bending over backwards. I think we had we were about 80% along when the pandemic hit, and so that's good. But we're getting all our inspections lined up. This is the real critical time period, and it has been business as usual. If anything, I think they've been fantastic.
I've heard similar reviews from folks who are working with cities that are going more remote and more virtual. I wonder if the inspectors prefer that as well. I know that a lot of them probably like to be more hands-on, and if they're only able to see it either from the sidewalk or virtually, I wonder if that's an issue. But moving forward, it could be a way for them to just increase their capacity in general.
Yeah, it has not been a hurdle at all, and in fact, the VA may use this. This facility is really intended for VASH clients, the veterans equivalent, to Section 8. But this is for a homeless population, and the housing is so desperately needed, as you might imagine. The VA may actually take it over temporarily, at least on an emergency basis. And so the city has really teamed up well with our contractor and the architect and everybody else to get this thing done.
Great, that's good to hear.
Go Leslie and then Sean.
I really was just going to say about the same thing. We've been talking to all of our developers, all our affordable housing developers who have projects in the pipeline. And what we've been hearing in San Jose in particular is that everything's been going great. So, David, to your point of what innovations in the future might we want to consider continuing, I think a lot of the remote response has been really, really good. So that's interesting. Now, at the same time, it may be really good because a lot of other construction is not happening. So I can't, I'm not sure if that's the reason why we're seeing it be so responsive. The biggest thing I'm hearing for developers when we're asking them what are you facing is that they're having problems with the 4% tax credit program. So they're not complaining about other things, but they're complaining about for competitiveness especially in the South Bay.
Yeah, and that's another issue that I think is being asked of the next federal bill, is to create some fixes for the 4% market, right? Because they really now have huge gaps because of that. So something to look for as well. Right, your local congressperson.
Right.
This is Sean. I'm with the V, which is a vertically integrated developer. We have a panelized building system and a factory in Union City, and then we have a lot of multifamily projects around the Bay. So in terms of impact, we saw definitely NIMBYs take advantage of the situation to try and shut down our one remaining project that has more than 10% PMRs in it. So they've been complaining about construction noise, and they jumped on that and just very quickly the city manager passed an emergency order with the support of city council to cut 3 hours out of every day and cut the weekends out. So that was painful. So if we see more of that, it's just, further restrictions of already, very challenging times. So that was one thing that was a negative from the, where I think NIMBYs jumped on that as an opportunity. And then in terms of positive, so this is in San Carlos, they already do digital building permit, and they also quickly responded and offered remote and video inspections. So that was cool to see. We saw Newark also did quickly inspections via remote or images. And then you're aware of what San Francisco is doing. So this has jump-started the entire, everything's going to digital. And, that may have taken another year. I don't know if that was already in process. It seems like this really forced it. So that was exciting. Hopefully that'll stay. In terms of funding our projects, debt markets have seized right now. And equity is much more cautious. So it's tough depending on where you're at in your project. If you're raising debt or equity right now, it's going to be very tough, which we are on multiple projects. And then depending on your strength, you're going to see some developers fail. And I saw Open Door, I think today, said that they're going to, this is an iBuyer, that they're going to probably have to start selling at a loss. So there may be some opportunities there.
I saw that as well. Yeah. It's good to hear that there seems to be consensus on the video inspections going better than probably the in-person inspections were going. And so if we can keep that moving as a best practice, that would be great.
And digital submissions.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I think a lot of planning departments were slowly moving in this direction anyway. So this kind of proved to be a catalyst to really move faster.
One other comment. Sorry, on Monday I have a planning commission hearing in San Carlos, and they're doing it on Zoom. So that was, they did that pretty quickly. It'll be interesting in terms of public comment. So I haven't had that experience. They basically are allowing public comment via dial-in. And
so I can chime in a little bit on that because I've done a handful of these now. San Francisco community meeting, San Francisco Planning Commission, land use. I was at the Berkeley City Council last night. And I was actually talking with Laura Foote from the Action earlier today about an event around housing advocacy specifically, because we have always had this talking point, perhaps, that 1 o'clock on a Thursday is not something that is accessible to most normal working folks who are generally going to be pro-housing. Well, now all of a sudden we actually have the ability to batch them in for an hour, in the middle of the workday. And so I think one of the topics, and I don't know if anybody on the team is here, but Balboa Reservoir, I think is going to be a really interesting example in San Francisco. 1,100 units next to a BART station. The Hack Project review team saw it this morning, and I think there's the realistic possibility that every one of their public hearings through approval is going to be digital. And so how are we able to organize stuff like this? I mean, it's not all that different. And, we've always generally believed there's far more pro-housing people out there than anti-housing people. Well, now we actually have a little bit of an opportunity to, to show some of that. And it's interesting. So Zarina mentions here, Hayward building inspectors are working full time and doing a great job on site, inspecting with social distancing. Just want to make sure everybody saw, we were very confused about all the different rules that were changing in different cities around the entire Bay Area. And so we worked with some of our allied organizations and put together a resource that I just dropped into the chat that actually goes city by city and county by county of, hey, how are planning commissions actually working? And so it's good that Hayward's got some good productive stuff. And if other folks have information on cities, we certainly want to consolidate that information as much as possible.
So Corey, I just want to be cognizant of the time. I think we said this was going to be for an hour, and I think we are 56 minutes into it. And so I just wanted to see if there's any last questions. If there are, raise your hand or pop it into the chat. And if not, David, thank you so much for your time. Really always appreciate it. Super, insightful. And so it's great. And look forward to hearing what comes out of Terner, short period of time, right? The world's changed in a really short period of time. And so it'll be amazing. And obviously, please let us know as advocates where you think it's best for us to put our shoulder, to the wall, to where it needs to be pushed and things like that. We want to play our role also. So, and again,
I don't think you need me for that. You all do such a great job of that. But I appreciate the opportunity to share. This stuff is changing day by day, and I have to be honest. Up until a month ago, my focus was almost exclusively on the state, and so I've had a pretty hard pivot to the federal level, which has been a lot of fun. If the circumstances were not so dire. That being said, you're going to see a lot of good work come out of the Turner Center in the weeks and months that come out, because we're really focused on making sure that we have more data and as much evidence as possible to inform all of these conversations we're having, local, state, federal level too. So hopefully it's useful. And thank you all for having me here today. Appreciate everyone hanging tight through the technical issues. But other than that, thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Great. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. And please join us Friday morning at 9 a.m. for what safety on the construction site looks like. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.